Welcome to Night Vale Whispers. I'm here to keep you company as you drift off tonight. Before we begin, like the video, subscribe, and tell me where are you watching from and what time is it. Now, get comfortable and let the stories begin. The swing in the backyard never stops moving. The rental house on Maple Street was too good to be true, and I should have trusted that instinct. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, hardwood floors throughout, and a rent that was nearly half what comparable places were asking. The landlord, an elderly man named Mr. Garrett, seemed almost desperate to fill it. Previous tenants left suddenly, he explained when I asked about the low price, his weathered hands fidgeting with the keys. Family emergency. Had to break the lease early, so I'm offering a discount to get someone in quickly. The house itself was beautiful, a 1940s colonial with crown molding and built-in bookshelves, the kind of place that felt like it had stories to tell. The backyard was spacious and well-maintained, bordered by mature oak trees that provided plenty of shade, and hanging from the largest oak, about 20 feet from the back porch, was a simple wooden swing. Just a plank of weathered wood suspended by 2 lengths of rope, the kind of thing you'd expect to see in any suburban backyard. It swayed gently in the afternoon breeze as Mr. Garrett showed me around, creating a peaceful, almost nostalgic scene. That swing's been there since before I bought the property, he mentioned when he caught me looking at it. Built solid, the kids in the neighborhood love it. I moved in on a Thursday in late September. The house felt immediately comfortable, like slipping into a favorite sweater. I'd been living in cramped apartments for years, and having actual space, a yard, multiple rooms, closets big enough to walk into felt luxurious. That first night, I sat on the back porch with a cup of coffee, watching the swing move slowly back and forth in the evening breeze. The motion was hypnotic, soothing. I made a mental note to try it out once I got settled. The next morning, I noticed the swing was still moving. Not unusual, I told myself. It had been windy overnight, but as I watched through the kitchen window while making breakfast, I realized there was no wind. The air was perfectly still. The leaves on the oak tree weren't moving at all, but the swing continued its gentle arc, back and forth, as if someone had just gotten off of it. I stepped outside to take a closer look. The moment I opened the back door, the swing stopped. I stood there for several minutes, waiting, but it remained perfectly still. When I went back inside and glanced out the window again, it was moving. Over the next few days, I began to pay more attention to the swing's behavior. It moved constantly when I wasn't directly observing it, but stopped the moment I stepped outside or opened a window. The pattern was so consistent it became almost comical, like some elaborate practical joke. I mentioned it to my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, when she brought over a welcome casserole on my 3rd day in the house. "Oh, that old thing," she said, glancing toward the backyard. "It's always done that. Something about the way it's hung, probably. The previous tenants were bothered by it too." Bothered how? Her expression grew more guarded. Just bothered. The little girl was afraid of it, wouldn't go near it. Can't say I blamed her. What happened to them? Mr. Garrett said it was a family emergency. Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment, then shook her head. "Not my place to say, but if you have any problems, you can always call Mr. Garrett. He's very responsive to tenant concerns." That night, I decided to test my theory about the swing. I positioned myself at the kitchen window and watched for over an hour. The swing moved continuously, never slowing, never speeding up, just that same gentle rhythm. When I stepped outside, it stopped instantly. But as I stood in the yard, I noticed something else. The grass around the swing was worn away, creating a small arc-shaped patch of bare earth, the kind of pattern you'd see from years of someone's feet dragging as they swung back and forth. The worn patch was much larger than the swing's current range of motion. I began researching the house's history, spending my evenings diving through public records and old newspaper archives. What I found wasn't exactly alarming, but it was puzzling. The house had changed hands frequently over the past 30 years, far more often than you'd expect for a property in such good condition. Most stays were short, ranging from 6 months to 2 years. Several former tenants had broken their leases early, citing personal reasons or family circumstances. The pattern suggested something was driving people away, but I couldn't find any specific complaints or incidents on record. The swing continued its endless motion, and I found myself becoming obsessed with it. I'd catch myself staring out the window for hours, mesmerized by its rhythmic movement. Sometimes I'd count the swings back and forth, but I always lost track after a while. The sound started during my second week in the house. I was lying in bed, drifting off to sleep, when I heard it. The soft creak of rope against wood, the faint whisper of air being displaced. The swing was moving in the darkness outside my bedroom window, and for the first time, I could hear it. The sound was gentle, almost soothing, but it kept me awake. Every time I'd start to doze off, the creaking would pull me back to consciousness. I got up and looked out the window several times, but the backyard was too dark to see clearly. All I could make out was the vague shape of the swing, a shadow moving against deeper shadows. The next night, I set up a motion-activated camera pointed at the swing. If something was causing it to move, a raccoon climbing on it, maybe, or some kind of mechanical issue with how it was hung, I wanted to capture it. The camera recorded 8 hours of footage, 8 hours of the swing moving back and forth in perfect, continuous motion. No animals, no wind, no visible cause. Just the swing, swaying endlessly in the darkness. But there was something else in the footage that made my skin crawl. At random intervals throughout the night, the swing would slow down slightly, as if someone had gently stopped it with their hand, then resume its motion a few seconds later. The timing was too irregular to be mechanical, too purposeful to be random. Someone or something was interacting with that swing. I decided to stake out the backyard that night, positioning myself on the back porch with a clear view of the swing. I brought a thermos of coffee and a camping chair, determined to solve the mystery once and for all. The swing moved continuously, just as it always did. I watched for hours, fighting off drowsiness, my eyes straining in the darkness. Around 3 in the morning, something changed. The swing began to slow down, not gradually, the way it would if the wind had died down, but deliberately. Someone was stopping it. I could see a small depression forming in the wooden seat, as if invisible hands were gripping it. Then I heard the voice. "Higher," it said. A child's voice, barely a whisper. "Push me higher." The swing resumed its motion, but faster now, arcing higher than I'd ever seen it go. The ropes creaked under the increased strain, and I could hear the swoosh of air as the seat cut through the darkness. "Higher," the voice repeated, and the swing responded, climbing even higher until I was sure the ropes would snap or the branch would break. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that backyard as possible, but I was frozen in place, transfixed by the impossible sight of an empty swing soaring through the air with increasing velocity. The motion continued for what felt like hours. the invisible child's laughter occasionally drifting across the yard. Sometimes the voice would call out, "Watch me," or "Look how high I can go," but there was never anyone there to see. As dawn approached, the swing gradually slowed down, returning to its usual gentle rhythm. The voice fell silent, and by the time the sun crested the horizon, everything appeared normal again. I went inside and immediately started packing, but when I called Mr. Garrett to terminate my lease, he seemed genuinely distressed. "Please," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "just give it a few more days. I know the swing can be unsettling, but she's harmless. She just wants someone to watch her play." "She?" There was a long pause. The Hendersons' little girl, Emma. She loved that swing more than anything. Spent hours on it every day after school, begging whoever was around to push her higher and higher. "What happened to her?" "Accident," he said quietly. "The rope snapped one afternoon when she was swinging alone. She was going too high, putting too much stress on it. Her neck." "The fall," he trailed off. "That was 12 years ago. The Hendersons moved out immediately, couldn't bear to stay. I've been trying to rent the house ever since. And Emma is still there. She doesn't understand that she's gone. She just wants to keep playing. The families with children, they don't stay long. The kids can see her, talk to her. It frightens the parents." "What about tenants without children?" "She tries harder to get their attention, gets lonely, I think. The swing moves more, the sounds get louder. Eventually, they all leave too. I should have hung up and called a moving truck. Should have packed my things and found somewhere else to live, somewhere without the ghost of a lonely child who just wanted someone to watch her play. Instead, I found myself asking, what if someone stayed? What if someone was willing to keep her company?" "I don't know," Mr. Garrett admitted. "No one's ever tried." That night, I sat on the back porch again, watching the swing move in the darkness. When I heard Emma's voice asking to be pushed higher, I answered. "I can see you," I said. "You're doing great." The swing paused for a moment, then resumed with what seemed like increased enthusiasm. "Really?" Her voice was clearer now, more substantial. "You can really see me?" I couldn't, of course, but I said yes anyway. That was 3 months ago. I'm still living in the house on Maple Street, still watching Emma play on her swing every night. During the day, when she's resting, the swing moves gently in whatever breeze might be stirring. But at night, she comes alive, swinging higher and higher, calling out for someone to watch, someone to care. The arrangement works for both of us. She gets the attention she craves, and I get to live in a beautiful house at below market rent. Sometimes I even sit outside and have conversations with her, though I can only hear her voice clearly in the darkness. She tells me about her school, her friends, her dreams of becoming a gymnast when she grows up. She doesn't seem to understand that she'll never grow up, and I don't have the heart to tell her. She's just a lonely child who wants someone to notice her, to validate her existence. But lately, I've been wondering about the other former tenants, the ones who left suddenly. Did they all just leave? Or did some of them stay in a different way? Sometimes, when Emma is swinging at her highest point, I think I can hear other voices in the wind, adult voices, calling out encouragement, cheering her on. And sometimes, just before dawn when she's winding down for the day, I swear I can see them. Shadowy figures standing around the yard, watching, applauding, trapped like Emma in an endless cycle of play and observation. The swing in the backyard never stops moving, and Emma never stops asking for someone to watch. And I've begun to wonder if, once you start watching, you ever really stop. Last week, a young couple came by to look at the house next door, which just went up for sale. They had a little girl, maybe 6 or 7, who ran straight to the fence and started waving at Emma's swing. "Who are you playing with, sweetie?" her mother asked. "The girl on the swing," the child replied. "She says she's lonely. She wants me to come play with her." The family didn't buy the house next door, but Emma keeps swinging, and I keep watching, and sometimes I think I understand why no one ever really leaves Maple Street. The swing draws you in, the rhythm becomes hypnotic, and eventually you become part of the show. I should probably call Mr. Garrett and ask him what happens to tenants who stay too long. But Emma is calling for me to watch her try a new trick, and the swing is moving higher than ever, and I find that I can't quite bring myself to look away. They always leave an extra plate at the cabin table. The invitation came on expensive stationery, the kind with a watermark you can feel when you run your fingers across it. Heavy cream paper with elegant script that looked handwritten, though I suspected it was just a very good printer. "Annual Holloway family reunion," it read. "Labor Day weekend. Grandfather's cabin. Your presence is requested." I'd been married to David for 3 years, and this was the first time his family had acknowledged my existence beyond polite nods at weddings and funerals. The Holloways were old money, the kind of Connecticut family that had streets named after them and portraits hanging in the local historical society. David was the black sheep, the one who'd married beneath his station and moved to Oregon to teach high school English. "You don't have to come," he said when I showed him the invitation. We were sitting in our small kitchen, the morning light streaming through windows that needed cleaning. My family can be intense. "I want to meet them properly," I insisted. "I'm tired of being the outsider." David's expression grew troubled. The cabin has a lot of history, some of it good, some of it. He trailed off, shaking his head. "Just promise me you'll stick close to me, okay? Don't wander off alone." The cabin sat on the shores of Lake Champlain in Vermont, accessible only by a winding dirt road that seemed to go on forever. It was larger than I'd expected, more of a lodge than a cabin, really, with a wraparound porch and windows that gleamed like eyes in the late afternoon sun. Cars were already parked in the circular drive when we arrived, expensive sedans and SUVs that looked like they'd never seen a dirt road until today. David's relatives were gathered on the porch, drinks in hand, their laughter carrying across the water. "David!" A woman who could only be his aunt swept down the steps to embrace him. She was perfectly put together in that effortless way that comes from money and good breeding. "And you must be the wife." Not his wife or my name, which she certainly knew, just the wife, like I was a piece of furniture that had been delivered with David. The introductions were a blur of names I'd never remember, and handshakes that lasted just a moment too short to be truly welcoming. There were about 15 people in total, ranging from David's elderly great-uncle to his cousin's twin toddlers. They all shared certain features: sharp cheekbones, pale blue eyes, and smiles that never quite reached those eyes. "Dinner will be served promptly at 7, announced David's grandmother, a formidable woman in her 80s who served as the family matriarch. "We maintain certain traditions here." The cabin's interior was exactly what you'd expect from a century-old family retreat. Wood-paneled walls lined with hunting trophies and faded photographs, massive stone fireplaces, and furniture that looked like it had been there since the place was built. Everything was perfectly maintained, but felt frozen in time, as if the last 50 years had simply passed it by. David showed me to our room on the second floor, a small space with twin beds and a window that overlooked the lake. The walls were covered with photographs of family gatherings spanning decades, all taken at the cabin. In every photo, the same long dining table was visible in the background, set with the same white china and crystal glasses. "Why twin beds?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Grandmother's rules," David said apologetically. "Unmarried couples don't share beds under her roof. Even married couples, apparently, if she doesn't quite approve of the marriage." As evening approached, I could hear activity downstairs, the clatter of dishes, the murmur of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter that seemed forced. When David and I made our way to the dining room at 7 sharp, I was struck by how the long table had been set. 16 place settings, 15 for the family members I'd met, plus 1 for me. But at the head of the table, opposite David's grandmother, sat an extra place setting, complete with plate, glasses, silverware, and a napkin folded just like the others. "Who's that for?" I whispered to David as we took our seats. His jaw tightened. "Grandfather. I thought he died years ago." "He did, 23 years ago." David's voice was barely audible. "But we always set a place for him. Family tradition." Dinner was an elaborate affair, multiple courses served on china that probably cost more than my car. The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone, touching on family business, mutual acquaintances, and shared memories that I couldn't possibly understand. I felt like an anthropologist observing some strange tribal ritual. But what disturbed me most was the empty chair at the head of the table. Throughout the meal, family members would glance at it, sometimes nodding slightly as if acknowledging someone's presence. David's aunt even asked, "What do you think, grandfather?" during a discussion about renovating the kitchen, then paused as if listening to a response that never came. "The plate," I whispered to David during dessert. "No one's touched the food." He followed my gaze to the head of the table. The plate there had been served with each course, just like everyone else's, but the food remained untouched. The wine glass had been filled, but never emptied. "It's always been this way," David murmured. "Even when I was a kid, we serve grandfather's plate, and in the morning, it's always empty." "What do you mean, empty?" "The food is gone. Someone clears it during the night, I guess." Or, he shrugged uncomfortably. "Grandmother says he's a light eater these days." After dinner, the family gathered in the main room for brandy and more conversation. I excused myself early, claiming exhaustion from the drive, and went upstairs to our room, but sleep wouldn't come. The cabin was full of sound-settling wood, the whisper of wind through the eaves, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Footsteps, maybe, or the creak of floorboards under weight that shouldn't be there. Around midnight, I heard David come upstairs and slip into the twin bed across from mine, but even his presence couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in the room. I woke before dawn, pulled from sleep by the sound of movement downstairs. Through the thin walls, I could hear someone in the kitchen, the soft clink of dishes, the quiet swoosh of water running in the sink. Someone was cleaning up from dinner. Curious, I slipped out of bed and crept downstairs. The kitchen was empty, but the dishwasher was running, and the dining room table had been cleared. All the plates were gone, including the one from grandfather's place setting. Couldn't sleep either? I spun around to find David's grandmother standing in the doorway, fully dressed despite the early hour. She moved with surprising grace for someone her age, her pale eyes sharp and knowing. "I heard someone cleaning up," I said. "Grandfather doesn't like a messy table," she replied, matter-of-factly. "He's always been particular about that, even now." Mrs. Holloway, your husband is dead. Yes, dear, I'm aware. Her smile was patient but cold. That doesn't mean he's gone. Some men are too stubborn to let a little thing like death keep them from their routines. She moved past me into the kitchen, beginning preparations for breakfast with the efficiency of long practice. I wanted to ask more questions, but something in her demeanor warned me off. Instead, I went back upstairs and tried to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. But at breakfast, when I looked at the head of the table, there was grandfather's place setting again. Fresh plate, clean silverware, filled coffee cup, as if it had never been disturbed. The second day followed the same pattern. Family activities during the day, swimming, hiking, games on the lawn with that same undercurrent of tension I couldn't quite identify. Everyone was perfectly polite, but I felt like I was being watched and judged, found wanting in ways I couldn't understand. David seemed increasingly uncomfortable as the day wore on. He kept glancing at corners of rooms, startling at shadows, checking over his shoulder when he thought no one was looking. "What aren't you telling me?" I asked him when we had a moment alone on the porch. "It's nothing," he said, but his hands were shaking as he lit a cigarette. "Just being back here, it brings up memories." "What kind of memories?" He was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, grandfather wasn't a good man. He ruled this family with an iron fist, and when someone stepped out of line, David's voice trailed off. "Let's just say there were consequences." "What kind of consequences?" "My cousin Tommy used to stutter. Grandfather would lock him in the root cellar overnight whenever he couldn't get his words out fast enough. Said it would teach him to speak properly." David took a long drag of his cigarette. "Tommy's mother, Aunt Ruthshe, tried to stop it once. Grandfather didn't speak to her for 3 years, didn't acknowledge her existence, wouldn't let anyone else talk to her during family gatherings. She was effectively erased from the family until she apologized for interfering with his discipline." "That's horrible. That's grandfather." David's smile was bitter. Even the family business, he controlled every aspect of it, even after his sons were old enough to have their own opinions. Uncle Charles tried to modernize operations once, back in the 80s. Grandfather cut him out of his will completely. Charles had to grovel for months before he was forgiven. "But he's dead now. Why does everyone still act like he's here?" David's laugh was hollow. "Death didn't change grandfather. If anything, it made him more demanding. The family still runs everything exactly the way he wanted. They still follow his rules, still seek his approval, and they still set his place at the table, because God forbid we should forget who's really in charge." That evening's dinner was even more elaborate than the first night's. Multiple courses, expensive wine, and conversation that carefully avoided any topic that might have been controversial 23 years ago. I noticed that whenever someone started to express an opinion that might have been too progressive or modern, they'd glance at the head of the table and modify their statement. David's cousin mentioned wanting to donate to a charity grandfather had disapproved of, then quickly changed the subject when he caught himself looking at the empty chair. David's aunt started to complain about her husband's spending, then stopped mid-sentence and apologized to the heir. It was like watching a family of adults being controlled by a ghost. After dinner, I volunteered to help clean up, hoping to get a better look at grandfather's plate. But David's grandmother shooed me away from the dining room, insisting that guests shouldn't do work. "Grandfather doesn't like strangers handling his things," she explained, and I realized with a chill that she wasn't speaking metaphorically. I went to bed early again, but this time I was determined to stay awake. I wanted to see who or what was clearing that plate every night. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it. the soft scrape of a chair being pulled back from the table, then footsteps, slow and measured, moving through the dining room. I crept to the top of the stairs and peered down through the railings. A figure sat at the head of the table, barely visible in the moonlight streaming through the windows. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned suit. His face was turned away from me, but I could see him methodically eating from the plate that had sat untouched during dinner. Every few bites, he would pause and look around the room as if surveying his domain. When his gaze swept toward the stairs, I ducked back, my heart hammering against my ribs. I waited for what felt like hours before working up the courage to look again. The dining room was empty, the table cleared, but I could swear I smelled pipe, tobacco, and cologne, the kind of old-fashioned scent that probably hadn't been manufactured in decades. The next morning, David's family announced that they were extending the reunion by a day. "Grandfather insists," David's grandmother said, and no one questioned this statement or asked how she knew what a dead man wanted, but David was having none of it. "We're leaving today," he told me as we packed our bags. "I can't do this anymore. Being here, pretending everything is normal." He shook his head. "Grandfather may be dead, but his control over this family isn't, and I won't be part of it anymore." We slipped out while the rest of the family was at breakfast, loading our car quietly and driving away before anyone could object. In the rearview mirror, I could see figures on the cabin's porch, watching us go. "Will they be angry?" I asked. "Probably, but Grandfather will be furious." David's hands were white, knuckled on the steering wheel. "He doesn't like it when people leave without permission. What can he do? He's dead." David was quiet for a long moment. Then, "The family business has been failing for years. Projects fall through, investors pull out, nothing goes right. But the family keeps running it exactly the way Grandfather wanted, because they're afraid of what might happen if they change anything." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid he'll withdraw his protection. They think his spirit is keeping the family together, keeping them prosperous. They don't realize he's the one holding them back." We drove in silence for a while, putting distance between ourselves and the cabin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed, that somehow Grandfather's influence extended beyond the shores of Lake Champlain. That night, in a motel 2 states away, I dreamed of the dining room table. In my dream, there was a new place, setting one with my name written on a small card beside the plate. And at the head of the table, a figure in an old-fashioned suit was smiling at me with cold, pale eyes. "You can't escape family," he said in a voice like autumn leaves, "and you're family now." I woke up gasping, but David was sleeping peacefully beside me. Outside, the motel's neon sign flickered and buzzed, casting red shadows across the walls. That was 6 months ago. We never heard from David's family again, which should have been a relief, but strange things have been happening since we returned home. Our mail gets delivered to the wrong address. Bills arrive late or not at all. David's principal at school has been questioning his teaching methods, suggesting he's too progressive, too modern in his approach. And sometimes, when I set the table for dinner, I catch myself reaching for an extra plate, just for a moment, as if some part of me remembers a tradition I never understood. Last week, I found a piece of expensive stationery in our mailbox. No return address, no postmark, just my name written in elegant script across the front. Inside was a single sentence: "Family dinner is served at 7 sharp." David hasn't seen the note. I've hidden it in my jewelry box, but I can feel it there like a weight. Sometimes I take it out and read it again, and each time the words seem a little clearer, a little more urgent, We've been talking about having children lately. David thinks it's time, says he wants to start fresh, build something new and better than what he grew up with. But I keep thinking about that dining room table, about the empty chair that's never really empty, about traditions that survive long after they should have died. And I wonder, if we have children, will we teach them to set an extra plate at dinner? Will we tell them it's just a family tradition, nothing to worry about? Or will we explain that some appetites are never satisfied, that some family members never really leave, and that the dead can be just as demanding as the living? The invitation is still in my jewelry box, and sometimes I think I can hear it calling my name. David's grandmother was right about one thing: you can't escape family, and once you're part of the family, you're always expected at dinner. The church bells ring at midnight, but the church has been abandoned for years. The job posting was straightforward enough: night security guard for a small industrial complex on the outskirts of Millbrook, Ohio. 12-hour shifts, decent pay, and the kind of solitude I needed after everything that had happened in the city. The complex housed a few small businesses, says a machining shop, a printing company, and some storage units, nothing that would keep me busy during the quiet overnight hours. What the posting didn't mention was the church. St. Bartholomew's sat on a small hill about a quarter-mile from the industrial complex, its Gothic spire visible from anywhere on the property. The building had clearly seen better days: broken windows, crumbling stonework, and a wrought iron fence that had been twisted by weather and neglect. Weeds grew tall around the foundation, and the cemetery behind it had become so overgrown that most of the headstones were barely visible through the vegetation. Been empty for 8 years now, explained Mr. Torino, the property manager who hired me. He was a small, nervous man who kept glancing toward the church as we walked the perimeter of the complex. Parish couldn't afford the upkeep anymore. Been trying to sell it, but you know how it is with old churches, not much demand. Doesn't look like anyone's maintaining it, I observed. City's supposed to keep it secure, make sure kids don't break in and hurt themselves. But between you and me, I don't think anyone's been up there in years. He handed me a set of keys and a flashlight. Your main job is watching the businesses down here. But if you see anything unusual around the church lights, people, anything, you're supposed to call the police. My first few nights passed quietly. The work was exactly what I'd expected, walking the perimeter every few hours, checking doors and windows, writing brief reports that no one would probably ever read. The complex was surrounded by farmland and forest, so the only sounds were insects, the occasional truck on the distant highway, and the wind moving through the trees. It was during my 4th night that I first heard the bells. The sound woke me from a light doze in the security office around midnight. 12 deep, resonant chimes that seemed to roll across the landscape like thunder. I sat up, momentarily disoriented, then looked toward St. Bartholomew's. The church sat dark and silent on its hill, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring down at the complex. I must have dreamed it. Old buildings make noise, and I'd been sleeping fitfully since taking the job. But as I settled back into my chair, I could have sworn I heard the faint echo of the last chime fading away across the fields. The next morning, I mentioned the bells to Mr. Torino when he stopped by to drop off my paycheck. Bells? His face went pale. You heard the church bells? I think so. Around midnight, 12 chimes. He was quiet for a long moment, then shook his head vigorously. Not possible. Those bells were removed years ago, sold to a church in Cleveland. The bell tower's been empty since before the place closed. Maybe it was something else, a clock tower in town, or... There is no clock tower in Millbrook, he cut me off. And even if there was, you wouldn't hear it from here. We're 5 miles from the center of town. He left quickly after that, but not before warning me to call him immediately if I heard the bells again. The urgency in his voice suggested this wasn't the first time someone had reported the sound. I tried to put it out of my mind, but over the next few nights, I found myself glancing at the church more often. During my perimeter walks, I'd pause at the fence line and study the building, looking for any sign of activity. The structure remained stubbornly dark and silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me in return. The bells rang again on my second week. This time I was fully awake, standing outside the security office during my midnight rounds. The sound was unmistakable 12 deep, melodious chimes that seemed to come directly from St. Bartholomew's bell tower. I could even see the faint silhouette of the tower against the night sky, though no light emanated from within. I grabbed my flashlight and walked to the edge of the complex, as close to the church as the fence would allow. The building looked exactly as it always did, abandoned, decrepit, lifeless, but the sound of the bells had been so clear, so immediate, that I couldn't convince myself I'd imagined it. The next day, I drove into Millbrook and stopped at the public library. The librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes, was happy to help me research the history of St. Bartholomew's. "Oh, that old place," she said, pulling out a thick folder of newspaper clippings and historical documents. "Such a shame what happened to it. It was the heart of the community for over a century." The church had been built in 1887, serving a congregation that peaked at nearly 300 families during the 1950s. But like many rural churches, St. Bartholomew's had struggled as young people moved to the cities and older parishioners passed away. By the 2010s, the congregation had dwindled to fewer than 20 regular attendees. The final blow came when Father McKenna died, the librarian explained. He'd been there for 35 years, and the parish couldn't afford to bring in a replacement. The diocese tried to merge them with St. Mary's in the next town over, but the distance was too far for most of the elderly parishioners. "What about the bells?" I asked. "When were they removed?" She consulted the documents. According to this, the bells were sold in 2018, 2 years after the church closed, helped pay for some of the outstanding debts. She looked up at me curiously. "Why do you ask?" I explained about my job at the industrial complex and the sounds I'd been hearing. Her expression grew troubled. "You're not the first person to mention that," she said quietly. "There have been reports over the years. People driving by at night, workers at the grain elevator, even some of the farmers in the area. They all say the same thing, bells ringing at midnight from an empty tower." "Has anyone investigated?" "The police checked it out a few times, but they never found anything. No signs of break-ins, no equipment that could make the sound. The city eventually stopped responding to calls about it." She leaned forward conspiratorially. "But there are stories, if you believe in that sort of thing." "What kind of stories?" "Well, Father McKenna was very devoted to his midnight prayers. Every night for 35 years, he'd ring the bells at midnight to call the faithful to a moment of reflection, even if no one came to the church. Some people say his spirit is still keeping that schedule." That night, I was ready. I positioned myself outside the security office at 11:55 p.m., flashlight in hand, watching St. Bartholomew's. At exactly midnight, the bells began to ring. 12 clear, beautiful chimes that seemed to float across the night air like music. But this time, I noticed something else. As the bells rang, a faint light appeared in the church's windows, not electric light, but something softer, warmer, like candlelight. I climbed the fence. I know I should have called Mr. Torino, should have followed protocol and contacted the police, but something about those bells called to me, drew me forward like a siren song. I found myself walking up the hill toward St. Bartholomew's, my flashlight beam dancing ahead of me through the tall grass. The front doors of the church were chained shut, but I could see that faint, flickering light through the stained glass windows. As I circled the building, looking for another way in, I heard something that made my blood run cold, singing, a single voice, elderly and quavering, leading what sounded like a hymn. The words were indistinct, but the melody was hauntingly beautiful. It seemed to come from inside the church, though I knew that was impossible. I found a side door that had been forced open years earlier, probably by vandals or curious teenagers. The chain hung loose, and the door creaked as I pushed it open. The interior of St. Bartholomew's was a ruin. Pews had been overturned or removed entirely. Stained glass windows were broken, and debris littered the floor. But at the front of the church, in what had once been the sanctuary, dozens of candles flickered in the darkness. And there, kneeling before the altar, was an old man in priest's robes. He was translucent, like looking at someone through frosted glass. I could see the damaged altar through his body, but he was undeniably there, lips moving in silent prayer. As I watched, frozen in the doorway, he rose and turned toward the empty pews. "Dearly beloved," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the ruined church, "we are gathered here in the presence of God to offer our prayers and meditations." He was conducting a service for an empty church, addressing parishioners who existed only in his memory. But as my eyes adjusted to the candlelight, I began to see them, two faint shapes filling the broken pews, translucent figures bowed in prayer. The ghostly congregation of St. Bartholomew's, still attending midnight services 8 years after their church had closed. Father McKennifer, it had to be him, continued his service, leading prayers and hymns that the phantom parishioners followed along with. Some of the spirits were clearer than others. I could make out the features of elderly men and women, their clothes spanning decades of fashion. These were people who had loved this church, who had found meaning and community within these walls, and death hadn't been enough to keep them away. The service lasted about an hour. As Father McKenna delivered his final blessing, the spirits began to fade, becoming fainter and fainter until they disappeared entirely. The priest himself lingered for a moment, his eyes somehow finding mine across the darkened church. He smiled sadly and nodded, as if acknowledging my presence, then vanished like smoke. The candles guttered out, one by one, leaving me alone in the darkness. I stumbled back to the security office in a daze, my mind struggling to process what I'd witnessed. By the time the sun rose, I'd almost convinced myself it had been a dream, a hallucination brought on by too many lonely nights and too much coffee. But the next evening, Mr. Torino was waiting for me when I arrived for work. "You went up to the church last night," he said without preamble. It wasn't a question. "How did you?" "Because I've been watching this place for 15 years, and I know what happens to people who hear those bells." His expression was grim. "You saw them, didn't you? The service." I nodded, unable to find words. Father McKenna never missed a midnight service in 35 years. Not when he was sick, not during blizzards, not even the night before he died. The church was his life, and apparently it's his afterlife too. "Why didn't you warn me?" "Because most people don't hear the bells, and those who do usually convince themselves it was their imagination." He sighed heavily. "But a few people people who are searching for something, who need to believe in something larger than themselves, they get drawn in. What happens to them? They keep going back, night after night, attending services in a ruined church, praying with the dead. Eventually, they stop coming to work altogether, stop going home. They just stay. The implications of his words hit me like a physical blow. Are you saying they die? I'm saying they join the congregation. He pulled out his wallet and showed me a photograph of a security guard standing in front of the complex, smiling at the camera. This was my predecessor. Good man, worked here for 3 years. Started hearing the bells during his last month. His car was found in the church parking lot. He was never seen again. But the police found no sign of foul play, no body, no evidence of violence, just an abandoned car and another missing person. Mr. Torino put the photograph away. Look, I like you. You do good work, and you deserve to know what you're dealing with. But I can't force you to quit, and I can't stop you from going back to that church. What if I just ignore the bells? Can you? He studied my face carefully, because once you've seen them, once you've been part of that service, it becomes harder and harder to stay away. Father McKenna is very persuasive, and his congregation is always looking for new members. That night, I tried to focus on my regular duties. When midnight approached, I went inside the security office and turned up the radio, trying to drown out any sound that might come from the hill. But at exactly 12 o'clock, the bells began to ring, and no amount of noise could mask their call. I found myself at the window, staring up at St. Bartholomew's. The candlelight was flickering in the windows again, and I could almost hear the faint sound of hymns carried on the night breeze. It would be so easy to walk up that hill again, to slip through the broken door and take a seat in one of those phantom pews, to be part of something larger than myself, something that transcended the boundaries between life and death. The bells rang 12 times and fell silent. The lights in the church windows faded, and I remained at my post, my hands shaking as I wrote my report for the night. But tomorrow night, the bells will ring again, and the night after that, and Father McKenna will conduct his midnight service for a congregation that grows a little larger each year as lonely souls are drawn to the only light in the darkness. I should quit this job, should pack my things and find work somewhere far from Millbrook, somewhere the dead don't call out to the living. But when I think about leaving, I picture that ruined church filled with candlelight and ghostly voices raised in song, and I wonder if maybe that's not such a terrible fate. After all, where else can you find a community that welcomes everyone, that promises eternal belonging, that never closes its doors? The bells will ring at midnight, and I'll be listening. I just don't know how much longer I'll be listening from down here. Story 4. The Cartographer's Lodge. The GPS died somewhere between the last gas station and nowhere. You'd been driving for 3 hours through Vermont's backcountry, following a route that seemed to exist more in theory than practice. The rental car's headlights carved weak tunnels through the October darkness, illuminating nothing but pine trees and the occasional reflective eyes of something watching from the tree line. You weren't supposed to be here. The conference in Burlington had ended 2 days ago, but something about returning to the city felt suffocating. Maybe it was the divorce papers waiting on your kitchen counter, or the empty apartment that still smelled like someone else's perfume. So you'd driven north instead of south, chasing the promise of solitude in the Green Mountains. The sign appeared without warning. Cartographer's Lodge, Historic Inn, Estrid 1847. It stood crooked beside a narrow dirt road, the paint so faded You almost missed it entirely. But the smaller sign beneath caught your attention. Vacancy. The lodge materialized from the darkness like something conjured from old photographs. 3 stories of weathered clapboard siding rose from a foundation of fieldstone, wraparound porches sagging under the weight of decades. Warm light spilled from tall windows, and smoke drifted from a brick chimney into the star-drunk sky. It looked exactly like the kind of place that should have been booked solid during peak foliage season. The front door opened before you could knock. A woman in her 60s stood framed in the doorway, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a wool cardigan that had seen better decades and smiled with the practiced warmth of someone in the hospitality business. "You must be looking for a room," she said, stepping aside to let you enter. "I'm Mrs. Thorne. Welcome to the Cartographer's Lodge." The lobby felt frozen in time. Leather-bound atlases lined floor-to-ceiling shelves, their spines bearing the names of places that might not exist anymore. Antique surveying equipment occupied glass cases between overstuffed chairs arranged around a stone fireplace. The air smelled of wood smoke and something else, something faintly metallic that reminded you of old pennies. "I don't have a reservation," you began, but Mrs. Thorne waved dismissively. "Nonsense. We always have room for travelers." She moved behind an ornate wooden desk and opened a leather-bound registry. "Just sign here, and we'll get you settled." You signed your name, noting that the previous entry was dated 3 weeks ago. For a moment, something nagged at the back of your mind. Shouldn't a historic inn in Vermont be busier in October? But fatigue had settled into your bones, and the promise of a warm bed overrode any concerns. "Room 7, Mrs. Thorne announced, producing an old-fashioned brass key. "Up the stairs, end of the hall. Breakfast is served from 7 to 9, though I suspect you'll want to sleep in." The wooden stairs creaked a familiar song as you climbed to the second floor. The hallway stretched before you, lined with doors bearing brass numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then 7. You paused, key halfway to the lock. Where was room 6? You backtracked, counting again. 5 doors on the left side of the hall, 3 on the right. The spacing seemed normal, but there was definitely no room 6. The hallway simply skipped from 5 to 7, as if the missing room had been edited out of existence. Room 7 was exactly what you'd expected from a historic inn. Wide, plank floors, a 4-poster bed with a patchwork quilt, and a small writing desk positioned beneath a window that looked out into the forest. A fire had been laid in the small fireplace, and someone had left matches on the mantel. The thoughtfulness of it should have been comforting, but as you unpacked your few belongings, that nagging sensation returned. You found yourself listening to the sounds of the old building, the settling timber, the whisper of wind through gaps in the siding, the distant creak of footsteps on the floors below. And underneath it all, something else. A sound so faint you couldn't be sure it wasn't your imagination. A rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers against wood. You tried to read, but the words swam on the page. Tried to sleep, but every time you closed your eyes, you found yourself counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7. The missing room nagged at you like a tooth with a cavity, impossible to ignore once you'd noticed it. At some point past midnight, you gave up on sleep and decided to explore. The lodge was supposed to be historic. Maybe there was a story behind the missing room number. Some superstition about the number 6, perhaps, like buildings that skipped the 13th floor. The hallway was darker now, lit only by a few weak sconces that cast more shadows than light. You moved quietly, not wanting to disturb other guests, though you hadn't seen or heard any evidence of them. The tapping sound was clearer now, definitely coming from somewhere nearby. You stood between rooms 5 and 7, studying the wall. The spacing was wrong. There was definitely enough room for another door, but the wallpaper, an ornate Victorian pattern of roses and thorns, covered the space seamlessly. You pressed your palm against the wall and felt something that made your breath catch in your throat. The wall was warm, not just warm from a heating system, but warm the way living things are warm. And beneath your palm, you could feel the faintest vibration, like a heartbeat, but wrong. Too slow, too deep. The tapping stopped. You jerked your hand back and stood frozen in the sudden silence. The sconces seemed to dim, casting the hallway into deeper shadow, and in that shadow, you could swear the wallpaper was moving. The roses seemed to twist on their stems, the thorns growing longer and sharper. A door opened behind you. Couldn't sleep either? You spun around to find Mrs. Thorne standing in the doorway of room 5, fully dressed despite the late hour. Her smile was the same practiced warmth from earlier, but in the dim light, it looked different. Hungry. I was just curious about the room numbering. You managed. Ah, Mrs. Thorne stepped into the hallway, closing the door behind her. You noticed. Observant guests always do. She moved closer, and you caught that metallic smell again, stronger now. Old pennies and something else. Something that reminded you of the butcher's shop where your grandmother used to send you as a child. There never was a room 6, she continued conversationally. Not in the traditional sense. The original blueprints show it, of course. The Blackwood family, they built this place. They were cartographers by trade, map makers. They understood that some spaces exist in the margins between places we can name. The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. Your breath began to mist, and the floorboards beneath your feet creaked differently now. Not the familiar settling of old wood, but something more deliberate, more alive. The family disappeared in 1892, Mrs. Thorne said, her voice taking on the cadence of a tour guide. All 5 of them, right here in the lodge. They were working on something when it happened, a map of places that shouldn't exist, territories that exist in the spaces between reality's pages. Behind her, you could see that the door to room 5 was opening again, though she hadn't touched it. The darkness beyond seemed to move with purpose, flowing out like liquid shadow. They succeeded, you see. They found room 6, or perhaps it found them. The wallpaper between rooms 5 and 7 was definitely moving now. The roses bloomed and withered in fast-forward cycles, their petals falling like drops of blood. The thorns grew into twisted branches, and between them you could see something that made your sanity try to fold in on itself. There was space behind the wallpaper. Not just empty space, but wrong space. Space that bent in directions that didn't have names, that stretched infinitely inward, while somehow remaining contained within the narrow gap between 2 rooms. And in that impossible space, shapes moved. Shapes that might once have been people, but had been twisted by their prolonged residence in a place that reality had forgotten to include. They mapped the unmappable now, Mrs. Thorne whispered, and when you looked at her, her eyes had gone completely black. They chart the territories between seconds, the countries that exist in the pause between heartbeats, and they're so very lonely. The tapping started again, but now you could see where it came from. Fingers too long with too many joints pressed against the wallpaper from the other side. 1 tap, 2 taps, 3 taps. A Morse code of desperation spelled out in rotting flesh. You tried to run, but the hallway had changed. What had been 20 feet of straight corridor now stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with identical doors bearing identical numbers. 5, 7, 5, 7, 5, 7. The pattern repeated into infinity, each pair of rooms flanking an absence that grew more pronounced with every repetition. Mrs. Thorne was beside you now, though you hadn't seen her move. When she spoke, her voice came from all directions at once. "The beautiful thing about being unmapped," she said, "is that no one ever comes looking for you." The wallpaper finally gave way with a sound like tearing flesh. Room 6 opened like a wound in the world, and from it spilled the accumulated darkness of every space that had ever been forgotten. The Blackwood family stepped through, their bodies stretched and twisted by decades of existing in impossible geometry. Their fingers had grown long and thin, perfect for tracing the boundaries of places that shouldn't be. Their eyes had become black holes that mapped the darkness between stars. They reached for you with cartographer's precision, ready to add your location to their charts of the unmappable. And as consciousness fled like water down a drain, your last coherent thought was a realization that would have been funny if it weren't so terrifying. You should have read the guest registry more carefully. Every name was the same as yours, written in the same handwriting, dated every few weeks for the past century and a half. You'd been here before. You'd always been here. And tomorrow, when the next lost traveler arrived, you'd be the one standing behind the desk, wearing Mrs. Thorne's practiced smile, welcoming them to the cartographer's lodge. After all, every territory needs its guides, even the ones that don't exist. Story 5, The Trail That Takes. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday. By Thursday, you were driving north through Pennsylvania's endless forests, chasing the promise of solitude among the Allegheny Mountains. The hiking trail you'd chosen was supposed to be a simple 3-mile loop, perfect for clearing your head without the risk of getting genuinely lost. The parking area held only your rental car and a weathered wooden sign, Whispering Pines Trail, 3.2 miles, moderate difficulty. Below that, in smaller letters that had been partially obscured by lichen, stay on marked path. Report any trail changes to park office immediately. You shouldered your day pack and set off into the October woods. The trail was well maintained, marked with white blazes painted on tree trunks every 30 yards or so. Fallen leaves carpeted the path in shades of amber and rust, muffling your footsteps to barely a whisper. The silence felt therapeutic after months of lawyers and arguments and the endless drone of a marriage dissolving. The first mile passed easily. You noted landmarks as you went, a distinctive boulder shaped like a sleeping bear, a wooden bridge crossing a narrow creek, an ancient oak tree with initials carved into its bark. The kind of details that would help you remember this hike later, when you needed to recall a time when walking forward felt possible again. The trail curved gently through mixed hardwood forest, climbing gradually toward what the map indicated was a scenic overlook. You found your rhythm, focusing on the simple mechanics of putting one foot in front of the other. For the first time in months, your mind felt quiet. At the overlook, you paused to rest on a wooden bench that faced west across the valley. Rolling hills stretched to the horizon, their peaks softened by afternoon haze. A red-tailed hawk circled far below, riding thermals that rose from the sun-warmed slopes. You pulled out your water bottle and checked your phone. No signal, which was exactly what you'd hoped for. The second mile led downhill through a grove of towering white pines, their trunks rising like cathedral columns toward a canopy that filtered sunlight into golden bars. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth, with an underlying scent of wood smoke that suggested someone had a campfire burning somewhere in the distance. You passed the distinctive boulder again, the one shaped like a sleeping bear. For a moment, you paused, confused, Hadn't you seen this rock during the first mile? But loop trails often doubled back on themselves, and you'd been lost in thought. Easy to miss the subtle changes in direction that would bring you past the same landmark from a different angle. The wooden bridge appeared ahead, spanning the same narrow creek. The water burbled pleasantly over smooth stones, and you stopped to splash some on your face. The cold was shocking and wonderful, washing away the last traces of courtroom fluorescence and conference room air conditioning. You were feeling genuinely peaceful for the first time in months when you saw the oak tree with the carved initials, the same tree you'd noticed during the first mile. The same distinctive pattern of scars in the bark, the same heart with RL plus MK forever gouged into the wood. But that was impossible. According to your mental map, you should be on the far side of the loop now, approaching the final stretch back to the parking area. You pulled out the trail map, trying to orient yourself, but the simple line drawing offered no real detail beyond the basic loop shape. Maybe you'd been more distracted than you thought. Maybe the stress of the past year had affected your ability to pay attention to where you were going. These Pennsylvania forests all looked similar. It would be easy to confuse one section of trail with another. You pressed on, telling yourself that the parking area would appear around the next bend, but instead, you found yourself at the overlook again, sitting on the same wooden bench, looking out at the same valley view. The red-tailed hawk was still circling, or perhaps it was a different hawk tracing the same lazy spirals. This time, you paid careful attention to your surroundings. You noted the exact pattern of lichen on the bench, the specific arrangement of rocks at the overlook's edge, the way a particular branch had broken and hung at an odd angle from a nearby maple tree, details that would be impossible to replicate elsewhere on the trail. The third mile took you downhill through the pine grove again. The wood smoke smell was stronger now, though you still couldn't locate its source. And there was something else in the air, a faint metallic scent that reminded you of pennies left too long in a pocket. When you reached the Sleeping Bear boulder for the third time, you stopped walking entirely. Your hands were shaking as you pulled out your phone, hoping for enough signal to call for help, but the screen showed only no service and a battery at 40%. You examined the boulder carefully, running your hands over its surface. It was definitely the same rock, the same unusual striations in the granite, the same patch of bright green moss on its northern face. But something was different. The moss patch was smaller. Not by much, maybe 6 inches in diameter instead of 8, but definitely smaller than it had been the first 2 times you passed. You stared at it, trying to convince yourself that you were misremembering, but the change was unmistakable. The wooden bridge looked exactly the same, but when you knelt to splash water on your face again, the creek was running lower, not dramatically lower, but enough that stones which had been submerged during your previous crossings now jutted above the surface like broken teeth. By the time you reached the oak tree, your heart was hammering against your ribs. The carved initials were still there, RL plus MK. Forever, but the heart shape around them had grown smaller, as if the wood was slowly healing itself, closing over the old wound. At the overlook, you sat heavily on the bench and tried to think rationally. Trail loops sometimes shared sections that had to be the explanation. You were seeing the same landmarks because part of the trail doubled back on itself. The apparent changes were just your imagination, stressed by months of legal proceedings and emotional exhaustion. But as you sat there, you noticed that the broken maple branch was gone entirely, not fallen to the ground, not hanging differently, simply absent, as if it had never existed at all. The fourth loop confirmed your worst fears. The Sleeping Bear boulder was noticeably smaller, its distinctive shape beginning to blur into ordinary roundness. The creek had dropped another few inches, exposing a muddy bottom littered with smooth stones. The carved initials on the oak tree were fading, the letters becoming shallower with each pass. And at the overlook, half the bench was gone. Not broken off or fallen away, just gone, as if someone had taken an eraser to reality itself. You sat on the remaining portion and stared out at a valley that seemed somehow diminished, its colors muted, its sense of depth flattened like a photograph losing its focus. You tried to run then, sprinting along the trail as fast as the uneven ground would allow, but running changed nothing. The landmarks appeared in their inevitable sequence: boulder, bridge, oak tree, overlook. Each one smaller, fainter, less real than the time before. By the seventh loop, the sleeping bear boulder was just an ordinary rock. By the ninth, the wooden bridge spanned a dry creek bed littered with dead leaves. By the 12th, the oak tree was a sapling with smooth, unmarked bark. Your phone died during the 15th loop. The sun should have been setting by now. You'd been walking for hours, but it remained fixed at the same afternoon angle, casting the same golden light through trees that grew progressively smaller and fewer. You stopped counting after 20 loops. The trail had become a narrow path through scrubland, the towering pines reduced to scattered saplings. The overlook was now just a slight rise in the ground, offering a view of rolling hills that looked increasingly like a child's drawing, all simple curves and basic colors, details erased by each repetition. Somewhere around loop 30, you realized what was happening. The trail wasn't just repeating, it was wearing itself away, like a record played too many times. Each circuit consumed a little more of the landscape, paring away details until only the essential shape remained, and you were part of that consumption. You could feel it now, a subtle diminishment with each step. Your memories of the divorce, of the arguments and paperwork and sleepless nights were becoming less vivid. The sharp edges of your pain were smoothing away, just like the sleeping bear boulder had lost its distinctive shape. By loop 40, you couldn't remember your ex-spouse's name. By 50, you couldn't recall why you'd been upset. The trail had taken your baggage, just as it had taken the creek water and the carved initials and the broken maple branch. Everything was becoming simpler, cleaner, more essential. You should have been terrified. Some part of you was terrified. But that part was fading too, worn away by repetition until only the most basic functions remained. Walk, breathe, observe the diminishing world around you. Loop 60. The trail was now just two faint grooves in bare earth. The forest had become a handful of stick-thin trees. The overlook offered a view of nothing but gray emptiness, like looking into fog. Loop 70. The path was barely visible, marked only by the faintest depression in ground that looked increasingly artificial, as if you were walking on a movie set that someone was slowly dismantling. Loop 80. You couldn't remember how you'd gotten here or where here was supposed to be. There was only walking and the vague sense that something used to be different. Loop 90. The trail markers were gone. The trees were gone. There was only you and a line in the dirt that curved gently through an empty landscape under a colorless sky. Loop 100. You pause at what might once have been an overlook, though there's nothing left to see, just gray emptiness stretching in all directions. You know you should be concerned about this, but concern is one of the many things the trail has taken, along with fear, sadness, joy, anger, and most of your memories. You start walking again because walking is what you do. It's what you've always done, as far as you can remember. You follow the faint line in the dirt because it's the only thing left that has any meaning. Somewhere behind you, or maybe ahead of you, since direction has become negotiable, New footsteps join the trail. Another walker, carrying their own cargo of pain and memory and complex human emotion. The trail is hungry for such things. It's always hungry. You don't turn to look. Looking is too complicated now, requires too much of what you used to be. Instead, you simply walk, following the path that grows a little more real with each new traveler who discovers it, who brings fresh details for it to slowly, lovingly consume. The loop continues. It always continues. And with each repetition, it becomes a little more perfect, a little more pure, a little more empty of everything that makes existence complicated and painful and beautifully, impossibly human. Soon, you'll be as simple and clean as the path itself. Soon, you'll be home. Story 6. The Monitor. The house came with the baby monitor already installed. You found it during the walkthrough. A sleek, white device mounted on the wall of what the realtor cheerfully called the perfect nursery. The previous owners had left it behind, along with the built-in shelving and a rocking chair that creaked when you tested it. Such a shame, the realtor had murmured, noticing your interest in the room. Young couple had to move suddenly for work, left everything behind. But their loss is your gain. This system is top of the line. Video, audio, smartphone connectivity. Probably cost them $800. You weren't planning to have children anytime soon. The divorce had been finalized just 6 months ago, and you were still learning how to sleep alone in a bed that felt too big. But the house was perfect otherwise. A 1920s Tudor in a quiet neighborhood, within your budget, with original hardwood floors and built-in bookshelves that made you feel like you were living inside a library. The nursery became your home office. You moved in your desk, your computer, your filing cabinets. The baby monitor watched over your workspace like a benevolent electronic eye, its green LED pulsing steadily to indicate it was powered on. You meant to disconnect it, but somehow never got around to it. There was always another box to unpack, another room to organize, another small crisis of single homeownership to navigate. Besides, the soft electronic hum was oddly comforting. After years of a house filled with another person's sounds, footsteps, music, phone conversations, the silence of living alone felt oppressive. The monitor's quiet presence made the space feel less empty, as if some benevolent presence was keeping watch. You worked late most nights, trying to rebuild a career that had taken a backseat to someone else's ambitions. The monitor's parent unit sat on your desk, its screen dark but its speaker occasionally crackling with the electronic whispers that all such devices seem to produce. White noise, you told yourself. Electromagnetic interference from the Wi-Fi router or the microwave downstairs. It was during your 3rd week in the house that you first heard the breathing. You were deep in a client presentation, eyes burning from staring at spreadsheets, when the sound drifted through the monitor's speaker, soft, rhythmic, unmistakably organic. The kind of breathing you might hear from a sleeping child, slow, peaceful, with just the faintest whistle on the exhale. You looked up from your computer, suddenly alert. The monitor's screen was still dark, but the audio LED was pulsing in sync with the breathing. In, out, perfectly regular, like a metronome made of human respiration. Your first thought was interference from a neighbor's baby monitor. These devices operated on common frequencies. Probably someone nearby had the same model and the signals were crossing. You'd heard about this happening before, urban legends about people accidentally listening to strangers' private moments through electronic eavesdropping. But when you checked the monitor's display, it showed a clear connection to the camera upstairs. No interference warning, no indication of crossed signals, just the steady breathing and the green LED pulsing like a slow heartbeat. You climbed the stairs to investigate, your footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The nursery was exactly as you'd left it: desk, computer, filing cabinets, and the empty crib pushed against the far wall. The monitor's camera was mounted in the corner, its lens trained on the space where a baby would sleep. The room was silent. You stood next to the crib, listening intently, but heard nothing except the house's usual sounds: the whisper of air through heating vents, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of settling timber. No breathing, no signs of life except your own. Back downstairs, the monitor was quiet. Whatever you'd heard was gone, leaving only the normal electronic hum. You convinced yourself it had been interference after all, or perhaps the sound of your own breathing amplified and distorted by the device's electronics. But it happened again the next night, and the night after that, always between 11 p.m. and midnight, always the same slow, peaceful rhythm. You started timing it, noting the patterns in a notebook you kept beside the monitor. The breathing typically lasted between 12 and 18 minutes, with a consistency that suggested deep sleep. Sometimes there were small sounds mixed in: a soft sigh, the whisper of movement against fabric, the kind of tiny noises that sleeping people make without knowing it. You called the company that manufactured the monitor, explaining the situation to a customer service representative who sounded like she'd heard stranger things. "Sometimes these devices pick up other signals," she said helpfully. "Baby monitors, walkie-talkies, even some cordless phones. Have you tried changing the channel?" You had tried changing the channel. You'd tried everything: different frequencies, different settings, even disconnecting the power for several hours. Nothing worked. The breathing continued, as regular and inexplicable as sunrise. You started staying up later, waiting for it to begin. Part of you was disturbed by the mystery, but another part found the sound strangely comforting. After months of sleeping alone, of coming home to an empty house and eating dinner in silence, there was something soothing about the presence of another breathing creature, even if it was only electronic phantoms. The first visual disturbance came during your 4th week in the house. You were working late again, the monitor's speaker providing its usual backdrop of soft static, when movement caught your eye. The screen had flickered to life, displaying the night vision view of the empty nursery, but something was wrong with the image. There was a dark shape in the crib, roughly the size and dimensions of a sleeping infant. You stared at the screen, your heart rate climbing. The shape was indistinct, more shadow than substance, but it definitely wasn't there when you'd left the room hours earlier. As you watched, it seemed to shift slightly, the way sleeping bodies do when they're dreaming. The breathing through the speaker became more pronounced, no longer just peaceful but somehow deeper, more present. You could hear the faint whistle on the exhale that you'd noticed before, but now it sounded less like interference and more like the breathing of something real. You grabbed a flashlight and ran upstairs, taking the steps 2 at a time. The nursery was empty. The crib contained nothing but a bare mattress and the shadows cast by streetlight filtering through the window. You searched the room thoroughly, checking behind furniture, inside the closet, under the desk. Nothing. Back downstairs, the monitor screen was dark again. The breathing had stopped. You spent the rest of the night researching the house's history, diving deep into county records and newspaper archives. The previous owners had been a young couple named David and Sarah Chen. They'd bought the house 3 years ago, full of plans for starting a family. Sarah had gotten pregnant almost immediately, and they'd spent months preparing the nursery, buying furniture, painting walls. installing the expensive monitoring system. The baby had been stillborn. The obituary was brief, just a few lines in the local paper. Baby Chen, beloved child of David and Sarah, passed peacefully at birth. Services private. In lieu of flowers, donations may be made to the stillbirth support network. The Chens had moved out 6 months later, leaving everything behind. The realtor's euphemistic explanation about work relocation was apparently a lie. They'd simply walked away from the house and all its memories, unable to face the nursery they'd prepared with such hope. You closed your laptop and stared at the monitor, its green LED pulsing steadily in the darkness. The breathing hadn't returned, but you found yourself listening for it anyway, straining to hear something that shouldn't exist but somehow did. The next night, the breathing came earlier, around 10:30 p.m., and lasted longer, nearly half an hour of slow, peaceful respiration, accompanied by the faint rustle of movement. The monitor screen remained dark, but you could swear you heard other sounds mixed in. The soft squeak of a mattress, the whisper of a blanket being pulled up, the tiny sigh of a dreaming child. You started talking to it. "Hey there," you whispered into the monitor's microphone. "Can't sleep." The breathing paused for a moment, as if listening, then resumed its steady rhythm. You felt foolish, but also strangely moved. If this was some kind of residual haunting, some echo of the Chen's lost child, then maybe it just needed acknowledgement. Maybe it needed someone to witness its existence, however impossible that existence might be. "It's okay," you continued softly. "You're safe. Someone's here." The breathing became softer, more relaxed. You sat in the darkness of your living room, keeping vigil with whatever presence shared your house, and for the first time since the divorce, you didn't feel alone. This became your routine. Every night, you'd wait for the breathing to begin, then settle into the chair beside the monitor and keep watch. Sometimes you'd read aloud, children's books you'd bought from the local library, their bright pages strange and wonderful in your hands. Sometimes you'd just sit in comfortable silence, listening to the rhythm of impossible respiration. The visual disturbances became more frequent. The dark shape in the crib appeared almost nightly now, sometimes shifting position as if turning in sleep. Occasionally, you'd catch glimpses of movement that seemed more substantial, the depression of a small body on the mattress, the rise and fall of what might have been a chest breathing. You stopped going upstairs to investigate. Whatever was happening, your presence seemed to disrupt it. Better to maintain the illusion, to preserve the fragile connection between worlds that allowed this impossible child to exist. Your friends started expressing concern. You'd always been social, but now you rarely left the house in the evenings. You turned down dinner invitations, movie dates, after-work drinks. How could you explain that you had a responsibility now, a nightly vigil to maintain? That somewhere in the electronic space between worlds, a child who had never drawn breath was finally getting the chance to sleep peacefully. The breakthrough came during your 8th week in the house. You were reading Goodnight Moon for the 3rd time. It seemed to be a favorite. Judging by how the breathing always grew more peaceful during the familiar cadences, when the monitor's screen flickered to life with unusual clarity, the image was still in night vision green, but the detail was extraordinary. You could see the nursery exactly as it had been prepared 3 years ago. Soft blankets arranged in the crib, a mobile hanging overhead with tiny stars and moons, stuffed animals arranged on the shelves. And in the center of it all, a baby, not a shadow or a vague shape, but an actual infant, sleeping peacefully on its back with one tiny fist curled near its face. The breathing through the speaker was perfectly synchronized with the rise and fall of its chest. As you watched, transfixed, the baby's mouth moved in what might have been a dream smile. Tears streamed down your face as you stared at the impossible image. This was what the Chens had been meant to see. This was the child they'd prepared for, hoped for, lost before they could ever witness its first breath. "Hello, baby," you whispered into the monitor. "I'm so glad you're here." The infant's eyes opened, not the unfocused gaze of a newborn, but something older, more aware. It looked directly at the camera, directly at you, and in that moment, you felt a connection that transcended the electronic medium between you. Recognition, gratitude, love. The image lasted only a few seconds before dissolving back into static, but it was enough. You understood now that this wasn't a haunting in any traditional sense. It was a gift, a chance for a child who had never lived to experience the love and attention they'd been denied, and for you to remember what it felt like to care for something beyond yourself. The breathing continued every night after that, but the visual disturbances became less frequent. Sometimes you'd catch glimpses of movement, shadows that might have been small hands reaching toward the mobile, the suggestion of a face turning toward the sound of your voice. But mostly, it was just the breathing, steady, peaceful, alive in the only way it could be. You stopped researching, stopped trying to understand. Understanding was less important than acceptance, less crucial than the simple act of bearing witness to an impossible existence. Months passed. The breathing became as natural as your own heartbeat, as essential as the rhythm of your daily life. You bought a more comfortable chair for your vigil, installed better lighting for your bedtime reading, even painted the living room walls a softer color that seemed more appropriate for nighttime conversations with a child who existed only in the spaces between technology and grief. Your friends stopped asking about your hermit-like behavior. Your family stopped wondering why you seemed so content living alone. You'd found your purpose, your calling, in the most unlikely place as guardian to a child who had never been born but somehow still needed someone to listen to its breathing, to witness its impossible dreams. The night everything changed. You were reading from a book of lullabies when the monitor's audio cut out mid-breath. The sudden silence was deafening, more profound than any sound. You waited, expecting the connection to resume, but the speaker remained dead. The green LED continued to pulse, but no sound emerged. You checked every connection, every setting, every possible source of malfunction. The monitor was functioning perfectly, receiving a clear signal from the camera upstairs, but the breathing was gone. For 3 nights, you sat in vigil beside a silent monitor, hoping for the return of your impossible charge. But the nursery remained empty, the device mute, the presence that had filled your evenings with purpose simply absent. On the 4th night, you received a call from a number you didn't recognize. "Is this the person who bought our house on Maple Street?" The voice was female, tentative, with the careful control of someone who'd learned to manage profound grief. "Yes," you said, knowing instinctively who was calling. "Mrs. Chen." "Sarah, please. This is going to sound insane, but I need to ask you something. The baby monitor we left behind, have you noticed anything unusual about it?" You closed your eyes, understanding what she was asking, what she needed to hear. "Yes," you said simply. "I've been listening." The silence stretched between you, filled with the weight of shared impossible experience. "David thinks I'm losing my mind," she whispered finally, "but I can hear it sometimes when I'm driving past the house. Through the car's Bluetooth, through my phone when I'm nearby, just for a few seconds, but I can hear. Breathing," you finished, peaceful breathing, like a child sleeping. "Oh God," she sobbed, "you hear it too. I'm not crazy." "No," you said firmly, "you're not crazy, and you're not alone." You met the next day at a coffee shop downtown. Sarah Chen was a small woman in her early 30s, with the kind of careful composure that comes from navigating public spaces while carrying private grief. She'd brought printouts of the monitor's technical specifications, research into electromagnetic anomalies, theories about residual energy, and electronic recording. But when you described the breathing, the timing, the way it seemed to respond to your voice, she set aside her papers and simply listened. "I never got to hear that," she said finally. "The breathing. We prepared for everything, the sleepless nights, the crying, the endless feeding schedule, but we never got to hear our baby sleep. Would you like to?" you asked. "Tonight?" She looked at you with an expression of desperate hope that broke your heart. "Would that be? Could we?" "I think," you said carefully, "that's exactly what's supposed to happen." That evening, you sat together in the living room, the monitor between you like a shrine to impossible possibilities. The breathing began right on schedule, 11:17 p.m., according to your notebook. But this time, it was different, stronger, more present, as if the presence on the other end had been waiting for this moment. Sarah gasped when she heard it, her hands flying to her mouth. That's really..." "Shh," you whispered. "Just listen." The breathing continued for over an hour that night, the longest session you'd ever experienced. Through the speaker came not just respiration but other sounds, the soft rustle of movement, tiny sighs, even what might have been sleep babbling. The sounds of a child dreaming peacefully, safe and loved, and finally, impossibly, alive. Sarah cried silently, her tears falling onto hands that had never held her child but now cradled the monitor that carried its voice. When the breathing finally faded, she looked at you with an expression of profound gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for listening, for being here." "Thank you," you replied, "for sharing." She visited regularly after that, sometimes with David, who remained skeptical but couldn't deny the comfort it brought his wife. They'd sit with you during the evening vigil, taking turns reading bedtime stories to an audience that existed only in the electromagnetic spaces between worlds. Gradually, the breathing sessions grew shorter, less frequent, not fading but completing, like a lullaby that was finally being sung to its end. The visual disturbances stopped entirely, as if the presence no longer needed to prove its existence. On the last night you heard the breathing. It was so soft you almost missed it. Just a few minutes of gentle respiration, followed by a sound you'd never heard before, something that might have been a contented sigh, or perhaps a whispered goodbye. The monitor fell silent after that, but you kept it anyway. Sarah and David moved back to the area, bought a house just a few blocks away. They visit sometimes, not to listen for impossible sounds, but simply to sit together in a room where love had transcended every boundary that should have made it impossible. The nursery remains your office, but now it feels different. Not empty, but complete. Not haunted, but blessed. The monitor sits on your desk, its green LED still pulsing steadily, ready to receive whatever signals might need witnessing. Sometimes, late at night, you still listen for breathing. Not because you expect to hear it, but because listening has become a form of prayer, a way of honoring the mystery of consciousness that persists even when life cannot. And sometimes, just sometimes, in the quiet moments between heartbeats, you could swear you hear an echo of something that was never meant to be silent, the sound of love breathing in the spaces between worlds, keeping watch over all the impossible children who need someone, anyone, to witness their dreams. Tonight's whispers end here. If your eyes are still open, don't turn around. Let the dark take care of everything. Sleep well.